In the early 1950s, there was a strip of sky over Northwest Korea that pilots talked about the way sailors talk about reefs, half awe, half warning. They called it MiG Alley, and up there the air was thin, the sun was sharp, and the first generation of jet fighters learned what they were really made of. At 40,000 feet, everything was violence and slow motion. You didn't hear engines the way you did on the ground. You felt them, through the stick, through your ribs, through the way the horizon tilted when you pulled too hard and the world tried to black out around the edges. In that cold blue altitude, the sleek silhouette of the North American F-86 Sabre became a kind of promise. Swept wings, honest controls, a fighter that didn't just fly, it forgave. The Sabre was the West Star, not because it was perfect, but because it could meet the Soviet-built MiG-15 on something close to even terms. And close was sometimes the difference between limping home and never coming back. For the United States, the F-86 was more than a weapon. It was a banner. Proof that American industry could build a machine fast enough to catch the future. And down in the southern hemisphere, far from Korean contrails and frozen mountains, Australia watched those dogfights with a cold, practical hunger. Australia had borders that were mostly ocean, obligations that stretched into Southeast Asia, and a problem that was becoming embarrassing. Their frontline jet, the British Gloucester Meteor, had done its job in the immediate post-war years, but the jet age was sprinting now, and the Meteor was already breathing hard. Against the MiG-15, it was too slow, too blunt, too yesterday. The obvious move would have been simple. Buy the American F-86F off the shelf. Proven machine, established logistics, delivery schedules already written. Plenty of countries were doing exactly that, signing checks, receiving crates, training pilots, but Australia in that particular moment had a different itch. They didn't just want a good airplane, they wanted the best version of that airplane possible. And more than that, they wanted it to be theirs. In Melbourne, at the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, CAC, engineers spread the American blueprints across tables like surgeons studying X-rays. The Sabre was elegant, yes, but to the kind of mind that can't look at a machine without imagining how to push it harder, elegance isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. The Americans powered their Sabres with the General Electric J47, a solid engine, reliable, combat-proven, familiar. But the CAC team kept glancing at another heart entirely, a British powerhouse that promised to turn the Sabre from a thoroughbred into something closer to a predator. The engine was the Rolls-Royce Avon. On paper, it was a masterpiece. More thrust, modern design, the kind of turbine you built when you were trying to wring tomorrow out of today's metallurgy. But it came with a brutal catch. It had never been meant to live inside the Sabre's narrow fuselage. The F-86 was a needle, slim, aerodynamic, purpose-built. The Avon was a beast, wider, hungrier, demanding air like a furnace demands oxygen. What CAC proposed wasn't an upgrade, it was a transplant, and if the body rejected it, the result wouldn't be a disappointing aircraft. It would be a smoking crater and a national humiliation. Still, the mood inside CAC wasn't timid. There was an edge to it, something like pride, something like stubbornness. Australia in the 1950s was tired of being a junior partner who simply bought what the great powers decided to sell. They wanted a fighter that could outclimb, outrun, and outgun the best jets the Americans themselves were flying. When the first crates of documentation arrived, when the first conversations turned from what if to how, a quiet truth settled into the room. To make the Avon fit, they'd have to rebuild the Sabre from the inside out. Engine swaps in magazines sounded romantic. Bolt this on, swap that out, test fly, done. In reality, swapping an engine is like swapping a spine. Everything connects to it. Everything depends on where its weight sits, where its heat goes, how much air it drinks, how it shakes the frame when you push it. The CAC engineers compared cross-sections and measurements and realized the swap was a lie. The Avon wasn't just larger, it demanded a vastly different volume of airflow. The Sabre's intake, perfect for the J47, was suddenly a straw trying to feed a furnace. So they started where the aircraft breathed. They widened the nose intake, reshaping the Sabre's face until it carried a distinctive look. Still a Sabre, but with a slightly more open, hungry mouth. It wasn't cosmetic, it was survival. Starve an Avon and it wouldn't just underperform, it could surge, stall, flame out at the worst possible time. Then came the internal crisis. The Avon was shorter in some ways, wider in others, and its center of gravity played by different rules. The airplane's insides had to be gutted, bulkheads shifted, ducts rerouted, systems moved like organs being relocated in a body that wasn't designed for them. At one point, the project stopped looking like licensed production and started looking like a daring act of reinvention. The fuselage was essentially split. A spacer section was introduced. Roughly 60% of the internal structure had to be redesigned. On the workshop floor, it became a jigsaw puzzle where every piece was custom machined, every tolerance a tightrope. Melbourne wasn't Detroit or Seattle. But the machines didn't care where they were built, only whether they were built right. The Avon's power and heat meant the fuel system couldn't remain as it was. Cooling ducts had to be reconsidered, gearboxes and accessories moved, fuel tanks were relocated. Structural strengthening rippled outward like cracks in glass, fixing one problem revealing the next. And then, just when the aircraft was already transforming, Australia decided to change the part that pilots cared about most when they finally got their enemy in the sights: firepower. The American Sabre carried 6.50 caliber machine guns, a familiar setup in the wake of World War II. High volume, lots of lead, a belief that enough hits would solve most problems. But in the jet age, fights were faster, closures were brutal, and time on target could be measured in fractions of a second. Australia took one look at that reality and made a blunt decision: fewer rounds, bigger wounds. They scrapped the 6 machine guns and carved space for 2 30mm Aden cannons, weapons that didn't just poke holes. They tore pieces off airplanes. One solid hit could shatter an engine block, vaporize a spar, or rip a wing apart like cardboard. But cannons don't come free. Their recoil is a kind of violence that doesn't care about optimism. Installing them meant redesigning the nose bay, changing ejection ports, reinforcing structures that suddenly had to absorb the hammering shock of 30mm fire. By the time the prototype neared completion, only about 40% of the original American airframe remained in anything like its original form. It still looked like a Sabre in silhouette, but underneath it was something else: a hybrid, an American skeleton, a British heart, and Australian muscle stitched into the seams. Now came the part that separates brilliant engineering from expensive tragedy. Now it had to fly. In 1953, at Avalon, the first CAC-built Sabre, designated CA-27, rolled onto the runway with a presence that made ground crews pause. Test aircraft always draw eyes, but this one carried a special tension. It wasn't just an airplane, it was a statement. A test pilot climbed in, helmet down, oxygen hose clipped, hands steady in the practiced way of someone who knows fear is useless. The cockpit felt familiar because it was built on familiar logic, but the moment the starter engaged, the difference announced itself. The Avon didn't simply whine like the earlier jets, it growled. A low-frequency, chest-deep sound that vibrated up through the seat rails and into the pilot's spine. It sounded less like a machine and more like a restrained animal. The throttle came forward, and the aircraft surged, not crept, not gathered speed politely. It leapt as if the runway was an inconvenience. When the wheels lifted, the CA-27 climbed with a hunger that made even experienced men grin behind their oxygen masks. In fighter combat, altitude isn't just height, it's options. It's the ability to choose when to fight, when to run, when to dive like a hawk and turn speed into killing angles. The Avon delivered what the engineers had promised, roughly a 50% increase in thrust over the original J-47 configuration. But the real magic wasn't a single number, it was the way the whole airplane felt rebalanced, lighter in spirit, sharper in intent. The CA-27 could claw up toward 45,000 feet with a speed that made older jets feel like they were dragging anchors. Where the original Sabre sometimes struggled to zoom, climb away from trouble, the Avon variant behaved like it had springs in its bones. Then came the cannons. During trials, the 30mm Aden guns introduced a new kind of problem. The recoil was so intense it initially caused structural cracking around the nose. That's the dirty truth of building monsters. You don't just get the strength, you inherit the strain. So CAC reinforced the fuselage with heavier skinning. They listened to the airframe the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, and they made it stronger where it complained. Once solved, the effect was terrifying. A Sabre had been a stinger, deadly but reliant on sustained fire. The CAC Sabre became a sledgehammer. Exchange pilots from the US who flew it reportedly came back with the same wide-eyed look. The handling felt like a classic Sabre, smooth, sweet, honest, but the acceleration was something else, a Sabre on steroids, a fighter that responded instantly, that seemed to surge forward the moment you thought about speed. In raw performance terms, the Avon-powered Sabre pushed the design to its limit. The original F-86 was subsonic, breaking the sound barrier only in a dive. The CAC version flirted with Mach numbers that felt indecent for the airframe, and under the right conditions, it could edge toward transonic performance in level flight. For a brief, bright stretch of the mid-1950s, a factory in Melbourne was turning out what many considered the finest air superiority fighter in the Western world, proof that a medium power could take a great design and make it sharper. To the Royal Australian Air Force, the CAC Sabre, often affectionately called the Avon Sabre, became more than hardware, it became identity. Pilots transitioning from the Meteor described the first takeoff like waking up in a different century. The Meteor needed runway, patience, and persuasion. The Avon Sabre needed a few seconds and a direction. In the air, the controls felt harmonious. CAC engineers had balanced the heavier nose armament and new engine configuration with changes to hydraulic boosts and structural tuning. The result was a jet that seemed to read pilot intent. Light touch, immediate response. In the kind of turning fight where G-loading decides who keeps consciousness, that responsiveness wasn't luxury, it was survival. And the cannons gave pilots a kind of grim confidence. With .50 caliber guns, you might see tiny flashes, small impacts, a scattering of sparklers on enemy skin while you try to walk rounds into something vital. With 30mm Aden fire, there were no sparklers. There was impact, tearing, the sudden catastrophic failure of a machine that had been whole a second ago. One pilot later described firing them as unleashing thunderclaps. The vibration could blur vision for a heartbeat, but if your aim was true, the enemy didn't get a second chance. Grace and grit. A pilot's airplane, forgiving enough for a newcomer, vicious enough for an expert. But the real world doesn't allow machines to remain legends in peace. The Avon Sabre's truest test came not in frozen Korean skies, but in the humid, sweltering air of Southeast Asia, where corrosion creeps into everything and weather tries to kill reliability. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Cold War was tightening its grip on the Pacific. Australia found itself on the front line of regional stability, and the CAC Sabre became a tool of diplomacy, silent, visible power parked on hot tarmac. They operated out of RAAF Butterworth in Malaya, later from bases like Ubon in Thailand, flying patrols that were as much message as mission. In the Malayan emergency, and later during the Indonesian confrontation, the presence of RAAF Sabres wasn't always about pulling triggers. Often it was about discouraging someone else from pulling theirs. Still, these aircraft weren't museum queens. They were adapted for ground attack when required, strafing with cannons that could chew through structures and vehicles with brutal efficiency. In the air-to-air arena, the Avon Sabre's climb rate and altitude performance made it a natural top-cover interceptor. It was hard to sneak past a fighter that could get high fast and stay there with energy to spare. Indonesian aircraft, including MiG types, were often met not with open war, but with tense shadowboxing, intercepts, shows of presence, warnings written in contrails. One of the most fascinating chapters unfolded at Ubon Air Base in the mid-1960s as the Vietnam War intensified. Australia deployed No. 79 Squadron to help defend Thailand against potential incursions, and suddenly the tarmac became a strange museum of generations. The compact, refined Australian Sabres parked near the hulking supersonic American machines, F-4 Phantoms, F-10-5 Thunder Chiefs, jets that looked like they belonged to a new era, bigger, faster, louder. At first, some Americans dismissed the Sabres as relics from Korea's dawn. Sleek, yes, but surely outclassed. Then came joint training. In a close-in dogfight, what pilots call a telephone booth fight, raw speed matters less than turning ability, throttle response, and the ability to keep energy through sustained maneuvers. Early Phantoms were heavy, and famously, in that era, many lacked internal cannons. In the tight twisting arena, those disadvantages became embarrassing. RAAF pilots used the Avon Sabre's agility like a trap. They would lure heavier jets into turning battles where the big American fighters bled speed, lost angles, and found themselves killed. Rep once solved, the effect was terrifying. A Sabre had been a stinger, deadly, but reliant on sustained fire. The CAC Sabre became a sledgehammer. It wasn't magic, it was mastery of aircraft, of geometry, of patience. A sharp knife in the hands of a skilled fighter is more dangerous than a heavy broadsword swung poorly. And Australia didn't stop evolving the Sabre there. In the early 1960s, they integrated a new language of warfare, the AIM-9 Sidewinder missile. With sidewinders on its wings, the Avon Sabre became an even stranger hybrid, a classic dogfighter with the fire-and-forget bite of the missile age. That upgrade kept it relevant far longer than anyone expected. In Thailand's tropical air, another truth emerged. The CAC Sabre was rugged, over-engineered in the best way. While more sophisticated jets wrestled with humidity, salt air, and maintenance burdens, the Australian Sabres maintained strong readiness rates. They were dependable sentinels, machines that started, flew, fought, and came back without drama. But aviation history is a moving treadmill. Eventually, even legends age. By the late 1960s, the world was chasing Mach 2. Needle-nosed fighters like the Mirage 3 signaled the future. Faster climbs, higher speeds, designs meant for missile engagements at ranges where you might never see your opponent clearly. Against that evolution, the subsonic dogfighter era was fading. Despite its Avon heart and 30mm claws, the CAC Sabre could not pretend forever. The RAAF began transitioning to the Mirage, and the Sabres gradually stepped down from frontline service. Yet their story didn't end in scrap heaps. Australia chose an ending that felt like strategy and generosity at once. From 1969 through the 1970s, refurbished CAC Sabres were transferred to regional partners, strengthening air defenses in Southeast Asia. For nations like Malaysia and Indonesia, receiving those aircraft was transformative. Suddenly, they had fighters with serious performance and serious bites, platforms that could anchor modern air defense. Australian technicians and pilots remained to train crews, passing on knowledge like a torch. Maintenance discipline, tactics, the small survival habits pilots never write down but always teach face-to-face. In a turbulent region, these aircraft became stabilizers, steel and aluminum diplomacy with a Rolls-Royce growl. And that's why the CAC Sabre's legacy still hits so hard, because because it wasn't supposed to happen. It was a country looking at an American legend and saying, we can make it better. It was engineers in Melbourne performing reconstructive surgery on an icon, reshaping intakes, relocating systems, reinforcing structures, and refusing to accept that greatness had to be imported whole. Today, if you walk through museums like Point Cook or Temora and you find one of the surviving Sabres, you might see it sitting quietly under lights. Painted metal, swept wings, the calm posture of a predator at rest. And if you're lucky enough to hear an Avon start, you'll understand why old pilots still smile when they talk about it. It doesn't sound like a modern jet. Modern jets whine, smooth and distant, like appliances. The Avon growls. It sounds mechanical, animal, hungry. It sounds like an age when a fighter could still feel personal, when the machine was small enough to be intimate, yet powerful enough to frighten anyone who underestimated it. The CAC Sabre remains the best answer to a question every smaller nation eventually faces. Why invest in your own engineering? Because sometimes the point isn't to match the giants. Sometimes the point is to take what they built, look at the limits they accepted, and push past them anyway. The Americans provided the skeleton, the British provided the heart, but it was the Australians who forged the flame, then flew it into tropical storms and cold dawns, proving that the junior partner from the South Pacific didn't just join the race. For one shining moment, they took the lead, right up near the edge of the sound barrier, grinning into the oxygen mask as their Sabre, their monster, their masterpiece climbed like it had something to prove.